Welcome back to the Mind of Sai Marie. Today, we are looking at the roots of resilience and the fragility of our foundations, specifically the foundations of our own identities and the hidden histories we uncover when our secured walls and worlds fall apart. My guest today has navigated the deeper, darker corners of folklore and fairy tales to show us what happens when comfort gives way to survival. Fresh off the massive success of her Authors versus AI initiative, we are revisiting her critically acclaimed, award winning debut novel. Alison McBain is a finalist for the Ian Book of the Year and a gold medal winner of the Literary Classics Book Award for her stunning fantasy thriller, The Rose Queen, published by Fairfield Scribes. Allison, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, you've built a life for your protagonist, Princess Mirabella, that begins with royal expectations, only to completely unravel when she refuses a forced marriage and is transformed into a savage beast. What was it about subverting this classic tale, making beauty the actual beast, that made you want to dive into the breaking point of this specific character?
First of all, ever since I was a kid, this was my favorite fairy tale. I loved to read Grimm's fairy tales a lot as a kid, the much darker ones, which were what people used to use to teach their kids like very strong moral lessons. And I don't know if you read them when you were growing up too, but they have a lot of darkness, a lot of consequences for your actions. So this was a fairy tale that I always thought that I would visit someday, and it just happened to be the first one that I actually ended up getting out there, getting published. So for the breaking point of the character, I think that one thing I always like to explore is how can I flip a story on its head? If I'm taking a classic fairy tale, how can that, you know, be turned upside down? So inverting the genders of the characters completely changes the story, and it allows different ways for the character to experience stress in the story, because the same things won't be, terrible for a character who's a woman versus a character who's a man. So there are different things that they react to. So it was a lot of fun taking that journey with my character and basically subverting the trope and allowing Mira, who is seen as someone who is, physically frail, a princess, not supposed to, get down and dirty really, have physical strength to literally save people in this village that she's sent to. So it really allows her to explore something that, a lot of women at that time, would not have been able to explore.
So, Mirabella is given a brutal 3 year ultimatum to solve the mystery of her curse or die. How do you write about a character facing such an isolating, ticking clock without losing the underlying thread of hope and determination?
Well, pretty much we all have a deadline. She just happens to know hers. I feel like this is something that a lot of authors do. So I definitely have pulled on things from my own life. And for example, having several loved ones who've had cancer. And to me, the important thing is knowing that as long as you're breathing, there's still fight left in you. And I wanted to write a character like that. I wanted to write a character who, even though she's surrounded by other people, she's facing something that is unique to her and something that is very hard for her to really, find others who have been in the same shoes as she has, because there hasn't been anyone who has undergone the same type of curse as her. But that's not to say that others can't help her and she can't help others at the same time. So, I'm a really weird mix. I myself am an optimist, but I also have clinical depression. So I tend to write these very convoluted, complicated characters that, might have ups and downs, but they have to stay positive at the same time. They have to keep on pushing to get through. And that's not to say that they don't sometimes fall flat on their face, but the important thing is to get up and keep going.
When Marabella is exiled to her mother's estate to hide the royal scandal, she discovers the tragedy runs much deeper. Her grandfather was murdered, and her mother's death wasn't from natural causes. So, based on your storytelling, what is the hardest thing for a person to reclaim once they realize their entire family history is built on a web of deception?
Well, I think if you ask anyone walking down the street, they will tell you that families are complicated. You can't choose your family. And that's something that I also like to put into my stories, into my books. Sometimes, the people who are most supportive can be family, but they can also be the ones who are least supportive and are actually the antagonists in the story. So in some ways, throughout this journey, Mirabella discovers this. She discovers that she already knew that her family was complicated and that there were a lot of unsaid things that her parents never told her. But at the same time, finding out more of their lives from before she was born even really opens up her worldview. There's a certain point in every young person's life where they're like, wow, my parents had a life before me. So, and they're always amazed. And so she goes through that same sort of coming of age realization. Granted, it's a lot darker than most of us have to face. And I think that is something that would resonates with a lot of people, because there's sometimes some family secrets that are buried very, very deep, and when they come out, they can cause a lot of trouble.
So, we talk a lot about reclaiming empowerment on this show. In your book, empowerment looks like an awakening to the dark truth, even when it points directly to the king himself. What can modern readers learn from the quiet resilience of a character who forces herself to see the rot in her own foundation instead of just hiding in the shadows of exile?
Well, at first, that's all she wants to do. She just wants to hide. And in a lot of ways, she has to come out of that shell. She has to realize that hiding is not the solution. And I think that's a common reaction for a number of people. A number of people, when faced with conflict, I'm this way. When faced with conflict, I like to retreat. So in a lot of ways, I I put a lot of myself into the character of Mirabella. But at the same time, life doesn't just stop because you want it to. Life keeps on going, and you have to deal with those really difficult, complicated things that you'd rather not. So Mirabella has to learn to believe in herself, even when cast out by her own family, even when facing, as you said, facing the king, her father himself. She has to learn to stand up for herself. And in the process, she learns more, not just about herself, but about her family and what has created her, what has brought her to this situation. And she learns how to give as well as take. So this complete transformation of her body ends up being a transformation of her mind as well.
So, bringing a debut novel to such a high critical acclaim, winning gold at the Literary Classics Book Awards, and securing a spot as an Ian Book of the Year finalist takes an immense amount of craft. What was the biggest level up you had to experience as a writer to handle these heavy themes of generational trauma while keeping the narrative gripping and immersive?
Well, as I mentioned before, authors pull from life. So I definitely did that a lot with this story. This was the first book that I had ever finished. It wasn't the first that I had ever started writing. There were a couple false attempts before I got to this one. So in my past, in everyone's past, there is trauma. There are things in life that we have to face that, can defeat us or can make us stronger. And so pulling on my own past, helped me create the character of Mirabella and the struggles that she goes through. And even though it's, the story is set in a fantasy world and is set nominally in sort of a past world, sort of based off of, the France in the 1600s, it still is relevant today. I would say that, like facing that trauma, bringing it onto the page, I like to say that writing is sort of my therapy. And part of that is just working out some of these things that a lot of people have faced. When you have trauma, it makes you stronger at the end when you come out on the other side. And especially for fiction, conflict drives a story forward. Without any conflict in the story, there would be no story. It would just be, puppies and rainbows and singing, along to songs, none of which are bad, but you need something for the character to face as well. So yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to take this fairy tale, which is, the original is very unrealistic. It's meant to teach a moral lesson, and trying to make it as realistic as possible, trying to really put myself in the head of the character and think, well, if I was in this if I was in this person's shoes, what would I do? How would I face this? And sort of moving on from there.
So, this story deals heavily with leadership and choices that will change the future of a kingdom and magic forever. When a person's world starts to burn and the choices they make carry that much weight, does the role of the thinker change from someone just trying to survive a curse to an active architect of the new future?
One thing that I like to put in a number of my books, not just this one, is the theme of the reluctant leader. I feel like some of the best leaders, both in fiction and in real life, are ones who don't necessarily search out the spotlight. So again, they're thrust into it through circumstances, sometimes through encouragement from others. So it can be a character that I feel that a lot of people are sort of sympathetic with. And that's one thing that I like to put in my stories so that people can really identify with what's on the page. It's hard if you have like what one character that I'm not the biggest fan of is Superman. Are you a fan of Superman at all?
I mean, I've watched a few, but I wouldn't say I'm like gung ho on it.
Yeah, I like darker characters. I like darker characters like Batman, for example.
Yeah.
He has like that very tragic past, and he funnels his darkness into helping others. So Superman, I mean, he's all powerful, right? And, like he doesn't have a lot of trauma in his life. So it sort of makes him a character who is hard, at least for me, to identify with because he's all powerful except for, that little kryptonite business. But I've never felt like that in my life. I don't know about you, but I think that having someone step into that role, the role of the reluctant leader, someone who is drawing on their past trauma and putting it forward into a positive outlook, I think that's something that a lot of us can really relate to. And I think that the reason I write is because I want to tell individual stories that people can identify with and illuminate those dark places, both in my soul and in other people's souls, right? And shed some light on it. One thing that I've read is that studies have shown that people learn better through stories than through lectures. So it's very helpful, I guess, to sort of explore these things in a fictional story because people will be able to identify themselves and see themselves in these stories that we tell.
So, if you could give one piece of advice to an artist or a family currently feeling trapped by an unfair ultimatum or a fracturing situation in their own life, what would that be?
Advice is easy. And I definitely would be happy to give advice to someone feeling trapped. I've been there. I've been there myself. I've felt trapped at different times in my life and figured a way out of some not so fun situations, shall I say. I think the number one thing is to stay positive and not give up because there are always different avenues that you can, head down. It's like, I was talking earlier about I've had family members with cancer, and that is like, it's a big thing, and it's something that most of us know about, either n- not necessarily ourselves, but we have family members, we have friends. It's something that touches a lot of lives. But being open and staying positive and exploring different avenues and realizing that there is no one answer. There's always more than one way, so that if you hit a roadblock, there's a way around that. And that's not to say that if you hit bottom and you say, yeah, today I just can't deal with it, that's totally fine too. But the next day picking yourself back up and keeping on fighting, I think is the most important advice I can ever give. Life is only over when it's over. Until then, there's hope.
So, finally, Allison, if the Rose Queen were a bridge between the deep secrets we inherit and the ultimate reality of personal sovereignty, what is the one virtue or truth you hate people take with them when they read Mirabella's journey?
Well, I don't think it is that terribly deep. So I hope the first thing that they take away from the story is to enjoy it. There are a lot of parallels that people can draw when they read the story and see themselves in it in a way. But overall, it's the fact that everyone, needs a little magic in their life, and everyone should feel empowered to turn a curse into a fairy tale. There are downs as well as ups, but every negative thing also has a positive thing as well. Again, I'm an optimist with depression, so essentially I like to when I can, I like to see the positive side of things. And that sounds like very, what's the word? Pollyannish, I guess. But one reason why people turn to fictional stories is escapism, right? When things are going bad, you can take a trip, in another person's shoes and see that life might not be so bad, or maybe there's hope at the end of the tunnel. So I hope that's something that, people reading my books, some of them are quite dark, but at the end, you come out of the other end and realize that there's still, there's hope for the characters, and yeah, hope for yourself.
Thank you for sharing your brilliant vision and your sharp narrative insight, as well as incredible storytelling craft with us today. It's been a profound journey into what it means to face the beast within and fight for the truth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
To everyone listening, go grab your copy of The Rose Queen, Book One of the Rose Trilogy by Alison McBain, available worldwide in paperback and ebook from Fairfield Scribes. It is a masterclass in suspense, integrity, and renewal. I will have it linked in the show notes, so you can just navigate over there and pick up a copy. And remember, the mind is the most important story that we'll ever tell. Thank you, as always, for listening to The Mind of Sai Marie.